Morning. We have Monday morning, February 22nd. I'm on target today. I made sure I knew what day it was, what day of the week it was. And we are here to continue our devotional times out of the book of Acts. And we're going to begin in chapter 4, the first 4 verses. Let me read these texts to you. And as they were speaking to the people, the priest and the captain of the temple and the Sadducees came upon them, greatly annoyed because they were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection from the dead. And they arrested them and put them in custody until the next day, for it was already evening. But many of those who had heard the word believed, and the number of men came to about 5,000. So this is the second sermon we have recorded of Peter preaching. And in the first one, we had about 3,000 men come into the kingdom through the preaching of the word. And now they're back in Solomon's portico in the temple. And a noteworthy miracle has taken place. Peter and John have declared to the lame beggar at the beautiful gate that they didn't have silver and gold, but what they did have they would give to him. And they said, "Rise up in the name of Jesus Christ," which notably drew a huge crowd around them because the man was walking and leaping and praising God, and everybody recognized him to be this lame beggar that had for years and years lain at this gate and asked for alms, and all of a sudden his feet are healed. The response of the people is wonder and amazement. And at that gathering of wonder and amazement, Peter begins to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. He did what they had been commanded to do by Jesus at his ascension. They witnessed to the resurrection. And in the witness of the resurrection is the gospel, because he proclaimed his death, having been killed, having been handed over by the Jews to the Romans to be crucified on a cross. But this man whom God had sent, the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one of God, whom the world killed, God raised up from the dead and testified through that resurrection to his holiness, his authority, his power. And in the name of Jesus, the lame man was healed. So you have all this taking place, and you have it taking place in the central seat or place of worship for Israel. The temple was the place where God had chosen to dwell, the temple in Jerusalem. And Israel, all of Israel, 3 times a year, the men would come, those who actually were able to, but they were pretty much required to. It was what they would do, and worship God in Jerusalem at the temple. The people who ran the temple were the priest and the group sect of Israel called the Sadducees. And they had, according to this text, they had a kind of a policing unit, the captain of the guard of the temple, that oversaw what went on. And many things would go on in the temple. There would be the buying and selling of sheep for the sacrifices, which the Sadducees controlled. There was the temple coin, so you'd have to bring your money and exchange it for the temple coin so that you could take the temple coins and buy either the sheep or the turtle doves or whatever it was you needed for an offering within the temple. So it was a religious system. It had the power of religion, and it was built upon the old covenant. And into this comes 2 fishermen, Peter and John, common men, untrained men. Didn't mean they were uneducated, but they were untrained as to the law, if you consider what the Sadducees and the priests were trained to do. And these common everyday laborers come in, and first they, through the power of the name of Jesus, heal a lame beggar, which draws attention. And then for the second time, we have recorded that Peter stands up and proclaims a message of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I think the first message in my mind also took place in this same area in Solomon's portico. And so the second time around, first time around you have 3,000 believe. Second time around you have 5,000 believe. So you have this huge expansion in just days' time of belief in Jesus the Christ, sent from God to be the Messiah, the one that they had all been waiting for. And he had been killed by the Jews, handing them over to the Romans for crucifixion. And Peter makes it clear that, Pilate would have let him go, but they chose to have a murderer instead of their Messiah. And now God has testified to who Jesus was by raising him from the dead. If he were still in the grave, the Sadducees would have presented his body. They would have opened that grave up and said, "This is the Jesus whom these people are proclaiming. These men are liars." But nobody refutes their claim that Jesus rose from the dead in these accounts given to us in the book of Acts. As a matter of fact, it is at least 8,000 men believe their word. Just the opposite of somebody refuting it, they believe it. And so into this scenario, if you believed in the promises of God throughout the Old Covenant, and if you were looking for the one, the deliverer, the Messiah of God to come to set you free, and all of this had taken place and this message is preached, and you were the church leaders as the Sadducees and the priests were, you would think a logical reaction would be, this has to be the one, let us believe. But we see just the opposite take place. The common masses of people receive hope and believe, but the Sadducees theologically didn't believe in a resurrection. Even though they were men of Israel, they were followers of the Old Covenant, they took part in the sacrifices, the morning and evening sacrifices and the prayers and all of the ceremonial religious things. They celebrated the Passover. They did all that Israel would do in the worship of their religion. These men theologically rejected the resurrection. And so the very thing that two common, untrained fishermen were proclaiming and having that word verified or approved of by miracles was absolutely opposed to the very theological foundation of the men who ran the temple. And many things went on in the temple that were not good. We'll see that as we continue through in the book of Acts, but we also know from the Gospels that in the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he upended the practices of the temple, of the selling and buying of animals and the money exchanging, and he let the animals go and he tipped over the money tables, and he declared to all the people that this was the house of prayer, the house of his Father. That was a direct insult and slam against the authority of the Sadducees and the priest. He not only does that once, he does that again at the end of his ministry. And now he has been hung on the cross and died. He's been put in the grave. God has raised him from the dead. He's ascended into heaven. And now you have these two guys back in the temple the second time proclaiming Jesus raised from the dead. the very thing they reject theologically. So you can understand the challenge for the Sadducees. Their livelihood, their income, their position as spiritual leaders in Israel, their control over the temple, the authority that they have allowed to have Rome to have over them, and that they have acceded to because it is elevating them in their worldly positions as church leaders. The power of religion can be seen in the livelihood and the person of the priest and the Sadducees in the temple. And now the very man who has attacked them when he was alive, his followers are back. Only they're proclaiming a resurrected Jesus, resurrected by the power of God. The very foundation of their power of religion is being ripped out from under them. And the whole style of their worship and all that they understand to be what they do is being shook and dislodged from them. We have the power of God meeting the power of religion. And what is the result? The result is Peter and John are arrested and thrown in prison. And we will continue through, obviously, chapter 4 in the days ahead. But we're going to stop with that result right there. Look at our own lives today. Much of what we see as our style of celebrating our faith, our temples, if you will, our buildings, our programs, all that we mentally understand as church. For those of us who are leaders in the church, all that we have in the understanding of how we view our position, our authority, our who we are, our identity, has been shaken by the pandemic with the restrictions on how we meet and when we can meet and how many of us can meet at a time and how we're able to minister. All of that has been shaken by the sovereignty of God, I believe. Now, the pandemic has swept through and is continuing. It may get better very much through this next year, and things may return to some kind of a normal. I would think somebody that thinks that we're going to turn a corner and the pandemic's going to be gone, and we'll just go back to what we were, will be in for a rude awakening. I don't think God would even want us to go back to what we were. I think it is a time for us to know that the power of God has not been diminished in our lives in any way. The commission of the gospel has not been affected in any way. It is still there. God has still given it to us. But our style, maybe our livelihood, especially for the larger churches who need a huge amount of money coming in to be able to take care of the buildings and the programs and the structures that's going on, and to be able to pay the salaries of the people who make a livelihood. There's a lot of things that have been turned upside down through this pandemic. In a sense, the power of God, I believe, is coming up against the power of religion, and we need to ask ourselves, how are we going to react to what's going on? Are we going to see that God and the church and the lordship of Christ And the power and the life and the message of the gospel has not been affected one bit by this pandemic. Our style in presenting it may have, but God is not limited by what's gone on. There are people who have continued to minister through this. I talk with a good brother in the Lord, Bill Arvin, who works with Reed Ministries. And they have not been able to travel over to the Ukraine and to different parts of that area of the world during this pandemic, but they have had other means of connecting with people that they might not have been able to connect with in the same way to the same degree because of it. They have continued to press forward in the ministry that God has called them to in Reed Ministries. And there are others that are in that same vein, that they are within the countries. We have a couple family named Will and Mary Joe in Japan, and they continue to be there working with the Japanese church through all of this pandemic. The gospel has not been put on hold. Others in our community are working through Zoom meeting with doing ELL, through reaching out to immigrants and refugees in the Somali community and through other parts of the country. And they may not be able to do what they would love to do and being able to do an in-person and relational thing, but they're able to get into the homes of people, and those people are coming into their homes via technology, and that in itself might never have happened. I remember working years ago with some older Somali men in ELL, and it took over a year before I was sitting in their living room having tea with them, talking to them. We met on a regular basis, but there was a reluctance to cross certain things, and yet now through this wonderful technology that we have in Zoom and other vehicles of social media, we are able to interact. Our style has been affected. But we need to not confuse the power of God with the power of religion. When we become upset with what's going on around us because it's changing our worship and the lives of our worship, we should take a step back and say, am I upset because the power of religion that I functioned in has been affected? Or is the power of God being affected? And if it's the power of religion, then we just need to look to God and say, God, how would you have me continue to be obedient to the commands that you've given me and to be able to love my neighbor and to love those around me? There's a lot of things I'm looking forward to being able to do as a pastor when this pandemic is lifted, to reach into people's lives in nursing homes and to be able to have meetings together and meals together and fellowship and social. But I hope when we do go back to those things, and I do believe we will, I hope we go back to them with a much, much more clear view of the power of God, having been shaken free from our style, so that we can be much more open to see what God is desiring us to do and how he wants us to do it. So I take that from just this opening chapters of verses in chapter 4 and what the disciples were going through. And I can see myself in the Sadducees in a sense of resistance when you take away my style of identity as a pastor. And I struggled with that over this winter is, if I can't be what I thought I was supposed to be, what am I supposed to be? And I don't know that I've resolved it yet, but it is something that I believe that God will bring us through to his glory and honor. So we look forward to seeing you on Wednesday morning, hopefully. Bye.